Hey everyone, welcome to week 2. First and foremost, I want to commend you for your analyses and critical thinking discussion. There were a lot of fantastic interpretations and perspectives, which makes me excited to jump into this material with you. Critical thinking is one crux of the course, and I would argue that the same is true for almost all college courses. So it's a positive step to commit to it now. In a literature class, there may be an expectation that we'll spend a lot of time reading and then discussing what happened in the reading, and that's true to some extent. But more importantly, we are exploring the things that are suggested or implied by the readings. To expand on this, we're taking what we know about the world, about human nature, about values, belief systems, good and evil, and so on, and we're using that information to explore what's going on in these stories. It's not just about what happens in the stories, it's about why it happens the way it does. It's about what the characters experience physically, mentally, emotionally. It's about digging deeper to explore each character and his or her thought processes, behaviors, and experiences. But we generally do this as part of a discussion. Discussion is absolutely the other crux of our course, and that's because critical thinking does not just happen on its own. It's something you learn over time after you start to consider other people's perspectives, other experiences, and other ideas. You start to understand that you can't just approach a subject with the unwavering belief that you're right about it already. You study it, you explore, you consider those other perspectives. If you decide to accept a new way of thinking, you do so humbly and gracefully and graciously. And if you ultimately decide that you want to defend your original ideas, you do so properly. And these are things that we need to know how to do in life as well. I'm not certain if this is just a cultural issue, but in our society, we do seem to be somewhat terrified to admit that we can be wrong. A recent study was even published on this, discussing the detriment that this actually does. Realistically, we know that it's a strength to accept that what we know or believe may be marked by at least some fallacy. It's a strength to understand and to admit that we're capable of being wrong. It's a strength to want to learn more and to grow. So that brings us to our readings this week. First, I will acknowledge that these stories may seem somewhat daunting because they are a bit slower than what you may used to be reading. They were written a long time ago, so the language and the setup may both seem somewhat antiquated to you, but don't let that deter you from reading and enjoying them because these are outstanding stories. If the language starts to feel complex and you're having a hard time understanding or staying engaged, I encourage you to make small changes in your mind as you go along. For example, you can exchange complex words for simpler ones. Try to read a sentence for its comprehensive purpose or main point if reading every single complex word is getting difficult for you. Just focus on the main point of the sentence. First is Young Goodman Brown. This was written not long after the Salem witch trials, if you remember learning about those, by a man from Salem whose relative was a judge at the actual trials. So if you can imagine the lifestyle of that time period, including the setup of the town, the clothing, the style of speech, along with the general state of hysteria that those people experienced, then you can envision the backdrop of the story. Goodman Brown is a man whose self-righteousness is problematic and arguably even debilitating. It ultimately impacts his entire life. So this is a tale of adventures, of witches, of faith, of doubt. It's a good one. I hope you enjoy it. And one thing that I want you to pay attention to as well, if you remember how the Salem witch trials all started, they started with a group of young girls just dancing in the woods. And you think, why would that be such a huge deal? And they claimed that they had been bewitched. Well, one thing that you should know, besides the fact that dancing was not allowed at that time, is that the woods themselves, this forested area, was considered to be kind of the devil's lair, if you will, somewhere dark, somewhere evil, somewhere that you shouldn't go. So, they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And you will find that setting appears in Young Goodman Brown. So keep that in mind when you read. Next, think about the yellow wallpaper. This is also such an incredible story. The author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, much like the narrator or speaker of the story, probably experienced what we would now call depression and anxiety. And in fact, in the case of the story, it's very specifically postpartum depression and anxiety. And if you understand the complexities of depression and anxiety both, and if you can appreciate how poorly our society often handles mental health concerns even today, then you'll have a good idea of just how shockingly bad it must have been at the time of this writing in the late 1800s. Women were expected to defer to their husbands, first of all. So this woman, the narrator in our tale, she didn't even have a say in what happened to her. She was expected to obey in a very, very literal sense. So if a woman was going through something difficult emotionally or mentally, she was experiencing a nervous spell. And people at that time viewed this as being a relatively common condition for women. Certainly my grandmother wasn't born in the 1800s, but even she often talks about her nervous spells. So that's an idea that continued for a really long time. But these spells were thought to have been brought on by weakness of the nerves or by nerves that had been overexerted. So a Civil War doctor in the later 1800s, Silas Ware Mitchell, specialized in neuroscience and had become a widely known doctor for his theories and his treatments. A condition like the one we just discussed might be officially diagnosed as neurasthenia, and it was known by its symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, headache, depressed mood, irritability, and sometimes even things like physical pain or dizziness. At one point, doctors connected this condition with overworked people in more sedentary jobs, and then later, a physician also discovered that it dramatically impacted farm wives. After a while, it was very much overdiagnosed, becoming the popular or go-to diagnosis, and it was treated with Dr. Mitchell's rest cure, which we'll talk about in a second. But now think about some of these people who are being diagnosed for this weak nerves condition. Sedentary workers, wives who lived in the countryside and whose only companions worked from sun up to sundown, women who had recently had babies, to name just a few. So oftentimes the people being diagnosed were isolated. They didn't interact with others a lot. They maybe weren't able to engage in things that they enjoyed. They quite possibly didn't get a lot of physical activity, or they had recently just experienced something that was life-altering. And they were treated with a rest cure. The idea behind this rest cure was to rest and to re-strengthen these nerves that were thought to be causing the problems. But while doctors and family members, I'm sure, had the best of intentions, they essentially held people captive who were suffering from what we now know to be depression. They kept people relegated to a bedroom or confined to a couch. These people were discouraged from exerting themselves physically or mentally. So they didn't exercise or really even move around. They weren't encouraged to use their minds. In the case of our story, the narrator's husband, John, even forbids her character to write, which is something she enjoys. So she stays in one room, resting for months, rarely even going outside. In fact, she kind of decides that the outside is scary after a while. And this was not uncommon in real life. Doctors who held these beliefs didn't want their patients to tire themselves by talking to others or using their imaginations or moving around too much. So think about what it would be like for you to be isolated for days and then weeks, maybe months even, with few people to talk to, with very little to look at, with no way to really express yourself. You would stay cooped up inside the home a majority of the time with nothing to do. And of course, in this time period, no one had Netflix for entertainment. No one had Snapchat or Instagram to act as a technological confidant. There was no way to stay connected unless there was someone there with you, which often was not the case. So there was nothing. There was little to do besides stare at the walls, quite literally. Can you imagine what this would do to your mental state, especially if you were already living with depression or anxiety? What would happen to you? What would you experience? So now keep all of this in mind as you read. I'd like to talk very briefly about a couple of other things before you get started this week. I know for a video lecture, I only have a small window of time before I kind of lose your attention, but please stick with me. You can always stop and come back if you need to. The first thing is setting. While I'm not asking you to read about setting in our textbook this week, you will notice that it's important in both of our stories. The discussion about setting in the textbook is actually only 1 page long, so it is worth reading if you're interested in learning more. But here it is in a nutshell. Of course, the setting is where the story takes place. Now, in some stories, the setting really and truly could be anywhere. The setting doesn't necessarily matter. In fact, some stories don't even provide a setting for you. In others, it's essential to know the setting because the setting, to quote the book, the place and the time, plays so large a role that it is almost a character in and of itself. You will find that to be true in both Young Goodman Brown and The Yellow Wallpaper. The events in both are very specific, not only to a place like Old Town Salem, Mass, and a confined room with yellow wallpaper, but also to a time period. It's incredibly important to know and to consider what was going on in the times in which these stories were first told. So through setting alone, the authors are giving you numerous clues about what's really going on and why. Remember not to ignore those seemingly small but super significant clues. The next thing I want you to keep in mind is symbolism. Symbolism is another one of those words that a lot of people really run from, and it's pretty clear to see why. Even two very intelligent, learned, well-read people may completely disagree about what symbolism means and if symbolism even exists at all in a tale. Is it symbolic or is it coincidental or neither? Does it have greater meaning? Does it represent more than first meets the eye? Or should we look at it on a literal level alone? To me, this is what we can actually love about symbolism because we don't necessarily have to agree. It's very much subject to interpretation. But it is worth considering every time because it too can provide a lot of clues about what we're reading. So for example, in The Yellow Wallpaper, many people believe that the color yellow is super significant. I won't mention why because that will likely be a part of discussion this week, but I will be curious to see what you think. In Young Goodman Brown, symbolism seems to run rampant, at least from my personal account. Take the name of Goodman Brown's wife, for example. Her name is Faith. And I don't think it's an accident that Hawthorne named her Faith. She seems to represent everything this man loves about his own faith, his own spiritual faith. She's pure and she's good, at least until she's provoked by sin. And what about the ribbons in her hair? Some people argue that those pink ribbons are clearly symbolic of Faith's purity, her innocence, her youth, her angelic side. If that's the case, how can that impact your interpretation of the story? And the last thing I want to mention is just a quick reminder about simple word usage. The protagonist is, of course, the lead of the story. The antagonist is the villain or the person who causes trouble, the person who's problematic in the story. The narrator and the speaker, this is where people start to get confused. The narrator and the speaker usually refer to the same person, so those terms can typically be used interchangeably. The narrator or the speaker will be the person who is the voice of the story. This person is not the same as the author. In some cases, for example, in an autobiographical account, the speaker the speaker or narrator will be the author. But that's pretty specific to things like autobiographical accounts. I've been talking a lot, you can tell. However, that's often not the case. So let's look at just a couple of very quick examples of stories many people have read. The Hunger Games, for example, that's told from the perspective of Katniss Everdeen in the first person. She is both the protagonist and the speaker or narrator of the story. But she's not the author. Suzanne Collins is the author. And let's see, J.K. Rowling. She's the author of the Harry Potter books, and obviously Harry Potter is the protagonist. However, neither one of them is the speaker or narrator of the story. This is told in third person, and the third person speaker or narrator is simply a voice that shares the perspective of someone looking in on this tale. I hope that's making some sense, but please try to remember to use the accurate words when you write, and we'll talk a little bit more about that if there's any confusion. For your discussions this week and throughout the course, remember, never ever post summaries of what you've read, because I've read it. I assume the rest of the class has read it. So your job is to directly answer the prompt through your own personal interpretation of what happens in the story, along with what you know about life and human nature. Those are things you need to consider every time you write. Remember, before you write, you should not discuss the prompt in person with your classmates or friends at your school, because it's very easy to get caught up in that trap of, okay, what was my idea? What was their idea? And what happens is I end up reading a lot of discussions that are remarkably similar, which is actually not okay. These should be your ideas alone. So while I really encourage you to talk about and discuss the stories themselves, please refrain from talking about the prompts and the discussions until after you and your classmates have all posted your original posts and your replies. Remember, then you will need to respond to a classmate who has written about the opposite story. Your reply should be just as thoughtful and just as complex as your original response. You should engage with your classmates, you should endeavor to understand the stories better, and you should try to propel the discussion forward every time. Even your reply post to your classmate must demonstrate that you have read and understood that story and that you have a unique perspective on it. Since you're required to read both stories each week, I'm hoping to see a really good balance between both stories in the discussion. However, we'll take a look at that every week and see if we need to adjust at all. Again, think deeply. Ask yourselves why things happen the way that they do and why people think, react, and behave the way that they do. Let me know if questions come up, and I hope you will enjoy the readings this week. I am very excited to see what you think of them. Have a great week, everyone.